It is 1854. In the Scutari Hospital in Constantinople, the wounded of the Crimean War fill the wards. The moans and screams of the men reverberate around the walls, many of them left to suffer with no one to care for them. One English woman observes this scene in horror and resolves to revolutionize the care and conditions within the hospital. Soon, through the implementation of strict hygiene and care, she slashes the percentage of men dying from nearly half to a few percent, and, in doing so, sets the standard for all hospitals to this very day. Her name? Florence Nightingale, the mother of modern nursing. The woman known to history as Florence Nightingale was born on the 12th of May 1820 in the city of Florence, in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, in Italy. Her father was William Edward Nightingale, formerly William Shaw of Ecclesall, near Sheffield in Yorkshire, England. The Shaws were a well-to-do banking family. Their only son, William, when he came of age, inherited the estate of his maternal uncle, Peter Nightingale. As the closest male heir, William inherited £100,000 and his uncle's estate of Lea Hurst in Derbyshire, provided that he was willing to assume the Nightingale name and coat of arms. He also later acquired Embley Park, a large estate in Hampshire. Florence's mother was Frances Fanny Smith, daughter of the progressive parliamentarian William Smith. Both the Smiths and the Shaws had entered the realms of the leisured English upper class through trade rather than ancestral privilege during a period of increased social mobility in England, as newly wealthy families who had acquired their money through business and entrepreneurship acquired minor noble titles as an expression of their ascent within society. Fanny's grandfather had launched what eventually became, for his sons, an extremely lucrative and successful import business, specializing in sugar, tea and spices traded from around the world and Britain's ever-growing empire at a time when the trade in what were termed groceries was booming as a consumer middle class emerged in European countries like England. When William and Fanny married in 1818, they did not yet have a settled home to retreat to. The house on their estate at Lea Hurst needed to be rebuilt, and so, in the meantime, the newlyweds set out for an extended sojourn on the Italian peninsula that was to last nearly 3 years, a belated version of the grand tour for the pair. During the trip, Fanny gave birth to her first child, a daughter, on the 19th of April of 1819. She and William named the girl after the city in which she had been born, Parthenope, a former Greek settlement in ancient times, hence its name, which is today part of Naples. Florence was born just 13 months later in the Villa Colombaia, just outside the city of Florence, which she, like her sister, was then named after. Thus, the woman who would become famous for her innovations in the field of nursing was named after an Italian city in Tuscany and had a surname which her family adopted as part of an inheritance arrangement. The Nightingales promptly returned to England in 1822, when Fanny received word that her father's business had failed. As a result, William Smith lost a substantial proportion of his fortune, as well as his seat in the British Parliament. Fanny's parents became largely dependent, from a financial perspective, upon their daughter and son-in-law for the rest of their lives. The family's abrupt departure for England when the girls were just 1 and 2 years old respectively brought health challenges to both at a time when travelling from Italy to England with 2 infants in carriages and boats was not exactly an ideal way of travelling. After their return to Lea Hurst, Fanny thought to settle easily into her new home with her children, but Parthenope and Florence both seemed to suffer periodically from ill health. Lea Hurst was the seat of a local lead mining and smelting industry, and modern medical historians have theorized that the girls suffered from lead poisoning. Beginning in early childhood, both sisters suffered from headaches, digestive distress, and lethargy. Florence often complained of feeling a weakness in her hands. Her cursive writing developed more slowly than her sisters because of the pain involved in using finer motor skills. Until adolescence, Florence continued to use print rather than the more artful and difficult cursive script. Ultimately, the power of Florence's mind and pen would be vindicated. Despite living with debilitating ill health for most of her adult life, she nonetheless proved to be one of the most prolific writers and consequential medical reformers of the 19th century. With respect to their parenting practices, Fanny and William Nightingale proved to be quite liberal for their time, but they both came from families that were notably forward-thinking. Their beliefs and perspectives had an enormous influence on the development of Florence's own worldview and life path, though she differed from her parents too in numerous respects. Both the Shaws and the Smiths belonged to dissenting Christian congregations, denominations which diverged doctrinally from the Church of England. William Smith, Fanny's father, had been an ardent advocate for religious liberty as an MP in Parliament, as well as a fervent campaigner for the abolition of slavery and a Whig political reformer. Historians have noted how frequently social reformers arose from the ranks of dissenting congregations such as the Methodists and Unitarians during the 19th century, while the Quakers had driven the abolition movement from the middle of the 18th century. It would become clear later on just how much Florence Nightingale's own religious sensibilities and social perspectives were influenced by her parents and grandparents. Florence's later writings demonstrate her highly complex and heterodox religious views. Although she formally remained a member of the Church of England all her life, she took a dim and distrustful view of organized religion in general and refused to subscribe to various key Christian beliefs. She was, for instance, skeptical of the existence of hell or of the concept of eternal damnation for any soul, and believed in the Unitarian concept of universal forgiveness and salvation. Though she cherished a deep faith in Christ, she also believed that God revealed himself in many religions other than Christianity. Perhaps most important of all, Florence believed that one's duty to God involved using one's talents and gifts actively and working to help make people's lives and the world around her a better place. The Shaws and the Smiths were firm believers in women's education, and as such, Parthenope and Florence received as thorough an education as their mother and aunts had received, and as comprehensive as if they had been born sons rather than daughters. Both sisters pursued their educations at home and were primarily instructed by their father in an age when home-schooling of the minor nobility was common. William Nightingale set his two daughters a challenging curriculum, including French, Italian, German, Greek, Latin, history, philosophy, literature, and mathematics. Both girls excelled at their studies, but Florence quickly proved to be her father's star pupil. Parthenope was less interested in academic studies than Florence and gravitated toward their mother, with whom she had more in common. Deeply inquisitive and far less interested in artistic accomplishments or domestic pursuits than her sister, Florence spent much more time with their father, who appeared to think of her as akin to the son he had never had, or so it seemed to Florence, reflecting in later life. Her attachment to her father was remarked upon by the family's tenants in the nearby village, some of whom referred to Florence as, quote, the young squire. Parthenope and Florence, or Pop and Flo as they were nicknamed as children, accompanied their mother regularly to visit Lea Hurst's tenants whenever the family were in residence there, with particular attention paid to caring for the sick poor. Florence took to this work with great dedication and enthusiasm, and began to take over much of the work on her mother's behalf by the time she reached early adolescence. The family spent most of each year at their estate at Embley Park in Hampshire, beginning in 1825, but every summer they would return to Lea Hurst. Florence was a familiar sight in the village by age 14, bringing food and medicines to those in need among her father's tenants, as well as to families in the broader community. In 1837, when she was 16, Florence recorded in her diary that God had spoken to her. She did not describe specifically what prompted her to think so, but apparently she had had a religious experience during which she believed that God had called her to a higher purpose. What it was, she did not yet know, but the power of this experience convinced her to be vigilant and watchful for the time when her purpose might reveal itself. As it was, Florence and Parthenope were now approaching adulthood and completing their educations. Soon they would be old enough to make their entry into society, and William and Fanny began to look around for suitable husbands for their daughters. In 1838, William and Fanny Nightingale took the girls on a new European tour through Germany, Italy, and France, one which they would have lasting memories of, unlike in their infant years. Neither Florence nor Parthenope had been abroad since returning to England as toddlers, and they relished the sights and sounds of cities and landscapes they had only read about before. During their stay in Paris, the Nightingales paid a visit to one Mary Clark, an eccentric writer who regularly hosted one of the most fashionable literary salons in the city. A contemporary of Elizabeth Gaskell and Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pen name George Eliot, Clark's salon regularly hosted William Makepeace Thackeray and Anthony Trollope, while she lived above the apartment of the noted French historian François-René de Chateaubriand. Despite the 27-year age difference between Mary Clark and Florence Nightingale, the two women became fast friends and remained close correspondents for the rest of their lives. Over the next few years, Florence's relationship with her family became increasingly strained as a result of her reluctance to follow the path of marriage and domestic life that her family wanted for her. At home in England, Parthenope would begin to take on the role of someone who would marry the future head of the family, there being no sons to inherit the estate. She would eventually marry Harry Verney in the late 1850s, though she continued to read widely and began her own substantial enough literary career in the late 1860s and early 1870s. As Parthenope became more conventional back in the 1840s, Florence began to experience depression as a result of the unvarying and stifling routine she was expected to follow as a member of the British upper class in an age of empire and wealth. She began to lose some respect for her father, a man whose intelligence and compassion she admired a great deal, but who had spent his life and energy as a man of leisure rather than one of action. It was not considered respectable for the leisured upper class to have an active profession, and it disappointed Florence that her father had chosen a, quote, gentlemanly life, sacrificing the opportunity to make a real impact on the world in the process. Florence came to believe that it was a far better thing for a person to be useful in some way, to live one's life in an effort to contribute something constructive, positive and lasting, rather than to waste one's potential as an idle person. Her growing convictions in this regard would have a bearing on the stability of her wider family during the 1840s and 1850s. When they were 19 and 20 years old, respectively, Florence and Parthenope had the honour of being presented to Queen Victoria, the youthful Queen of Britain since 1837, and a monarch whose long reign down to 1901 would become so iconic that the height of Britain's empire is typically termed the Victorian era. Both sisters were much admired for their beauty, grace and poise, and garnered plaudits during their presentation at court. Florence had grown into a handsome woman, as her surviving portraits attest. She was described as tall and willowy, slim and graceful, with rich dark brown hair, greyish-blue eyes, and delicate features. She was dignified in formal company, but also noted by her family, friends, and acquaintances for her intelligence and quick wit. She could be quite funny when in the right mood for it, but she also had a sharp tongue when she was angry or incensed. This was most keenly demonstrated during this period in her composition of a little-known novel entitled Cassandra, a work in which she lambasted the idleness which she perceived was commonplace amongst the British upper class of her day, especially amongst women who were prohibited from engaging in politics and business which upper-class men could at least participate in. Her long history of closeness with her father had also given her a certain level of natural comfort with men, while her increasingly difficult relationships with her mother and sister instilled wariness in her when it came to friendships with women. For most of her life, she seemed to feel most at home in the company of men. The ease with which she cultivated relationships with male friends led to more than one offer of marriage from suitors over the years, all of which she ultimately rejected. Amongst Florence's numerous suitors for her hand in marriage, one in particular stands out for the length of the courtship. In 1842, Florence was introduced to Richard Monckton Milnes, Member of Parliament for Pontefract and 10 years older than herself. Milnes admired Florence's intelligence and seriousness and began a courtship with her that was to last nearly a decade in one form or another. "She is certainly a very remarkable person," Milnes wrote in his diary, "with a gravity of deportment which I can conceive many people disliking, and a clear, observant, critical way of looking at things which many might dislike, but which I find very analogous to my own. She is a companion worthy of any man of intellect, and is exactly the person whom my father would soon entertain a great respect for." Florence's own diary entries through these years indicate she likewise thought very highly of Milnes. Her parents let her know that they approved of him as well, should she choose to marry him. Florence worried, however, that marriage to anyone might require her to give up her calling, the true nature of which was finally becoming clear to her. In 1843, Florence finally made her will plain to her family. She wanted to become a nurse. William, Fanny, and Parthenope were perturbed by this decision, the very concept of secular nursing being a relatively novel one at the time, most duties for the care of the sick having been performed by religious groups for centuries. They were consequently opposed to Florence pursuing an active profession of this kind. 18th and early 19th century nurses were almost always working class, and there was no such thing as formal nursing training at the time. Moreover, there was a strange popular view in Victorian England that both alcoholism and prostitution were common amongst nurses. Hospitals of the time were also notoriously dangerous to health, and their patients died at alarmingly higher rates than patients treated in their own homes. Most hospitals were drafty, ill-equipped, and woefully understaffed. Thus, when Florence sought her parents' permission to train as a nurse at the nearby Salisbury Infirmary, they firmly refused to allow her to go. Having run up against her family's opposition once again, Florence's frustration and depression worsened as she chafed against the restrictions which had been placed on her. Ultimately, though, her economic reliance on her parents limited her options. The arrival at Lea Hurst of Florence's cousin, Henry Nicholson, during the late summer of 1843 cheered her somewhat. Henry was studying mathematics at Trinity College, Cambridge, and, hearing of his cousin's keen interest in the subject, offered to tutor her in all he was learning. William and Fanny Nightingale had forbidden Florence to continue with her study of mathematics, vetoing the advanced tutor that Florence's Aunt May had offered to engage for her. However, Florence's parents did approve of the increasingly close relationship that they believed was developing between Henry and their daughter, and so they allowed Florence to continue studying with him. Eventually, she became so adept in the subject that she began tutoring some of her younger cousins. 1 year after they had begun their studies together, Henry asked Florence to marry him, their being cousins not being an issue in an age when Europe's royal families were all related to one another, and first cousins often married to protect royal and aristocratic lines. William and Fanny Nightingale were elated. Henry Nicholson was the eldest son of a well-established family with a bright future in front of him, and the fact that he was Florence's cousin ensured that there would be no friction with in-laws. Yet, With as much compassion and delicacy as she could manage, Florence refused Henry's proposal. It was the beginning of a painful rift between Florence and her family, who could not understand why she would forego such a promising prospect in a husband. They were also deeply resentful that Florence's refusal to wed Henry had resulted in a new and frosty silence between the Nightingales and the Nicholsons. Florence grew more dejected and depressed in a home life increasingly characterized by guilt and blame. Since William and Fanny had no sons, the burden on their daughters to marry and have sons was that much greater. When William died, the Nightingale estate would pass to his nephew, rather than to Parthenope or Florence if they were unmarried by that time. Thanks to the practice of primogeniture, daughters who did not marry well and have sons to inherit their father's property risked major economic instability for all of the women in their families should the next male heir decide not to take care of them. In effect, to the Nightingales, Florence seemed to be abdicating her familial responsibility. It was her duty to marry and start a family to help secure the inheritance. Nevertheless, as much as it grieved her that they did not understand her decisions, she was determined not to follow this path and instead to persevere in her desire to become a nurse. Though her parents continued to refuse to allow her to train at Salisbury Infirmary, she nonetheless pursued healthcare and sanitation studies wherever she could. She already had many years of experience assisting and caring for the sick poor at Lea Hurst. On top of this, she now took the opportunity to develop relationships and correspondence with professionals in the medical field who might help further her knowledge and training. She began to read government reports documenting the practices and conditions in the nation's hospitals and sanatoria. While the advent of the first vaccines a half a century earlier had led to immense changes in terms of mortality from smallpox, the cancer of early modern Europe, new diseases had just as quickly replaced it. In particular, Florence would have read about the Blue Death, the colloquial name for cholera in the 19th century, several epidemics of which struck Europe one after another between the mid-1810s and the late 1890s. The third such wave struck Britain in the late 1840s, killing over 20,000 people. Though her family's position living in the countryside kept them away from the main centres of the disease in London, Manchester, Newcastle, and other large cities, she must have looked on at these events and wondered what caused the epidemic. What unseen entities related to the unsanitary conditions of mass urban settings could breed disease and death to such an extensive degree? Florence travelled extensively throughout the latter part of her 20s, as her family life at home deteriorated and she grew more and more depressed, stifled and in need of distraction. She took an extended trip to Rome in 1847 and travelled throughout Greece and Egypt with friends in 1849. Prior to her departure, with a heavy and conflicted heart, Florence finally refused Richard Monckton Milnes's latest proposal of marriage. William Nightingale stopped speaking to her after he learned that his 29-year-old daughter had refused yet another very suitable offer of marriage. In her diary, Florence admitted to Milnes's fine qualities. He had remained devoted to her for many years, yet she ultimately thought of him as a dear friend, one she did not want to lose, though not a prospective husband. She had agonized over the risks of finally closing the door on marriage, but ultimately decided that she had to do so. In her diary, she wrote in a somewhat conflicted fashion, perhaps reflecting her tortured state of mind concerning the proposed marriage, quote, "I have an intellectual nature which requires satisfaction. I also have a moral, an active nature which requires satisfaction, and that would not find it in his life. I could be satisfied to spend a life with him, combining our different powers in some great object. I could not satisfy this nature by spending a life with him in making society and arranging domestic things. To be nailed to a continuation and exaggeration of my present life, without hope of another, would be intolerable to me." Florence and Milnes remained friends and correspondents for the rest of their lives, though they would never marry. Milnes, who never wavered in his admiration for Miss Nightingale, even named his second daughter Florence after her. It was seemingly a classic case of unrequited love. Meanwhile, during her travels throughout the Mediterranean, Florence had occasion to visit several hospitals which were run by Catholic nuns, and was impressed at the level of order and cleanliness which some of these religious houses had been able to implement in their clinics and convalescent spaces compared to most civilian hospitals. This was despite the pressure on their services as famine, revolution, and cholera stalked Europe in the second half of the 1840s, leading to millions of deaths. On her way home to England via Germany, Florence visited the Kaiserwerth Institute in the city of Düsseldorf, a charity hospital and nursing training school for Protestant deaconesses that had been founded under the direction of Pastor Theodor Fliedner in 1836. She admired the models of treatment and care that the Institute's trained staff were providing to their patients, and was thrilled to learn that the Institute offered nursing training. Florence returned home in 1850. Her relationship with her family during the previous few years had driven her to the brink of a nervous breakdown, but now, at 30 years old, she was ready to live her life on her own terms. Florence informed her family that she wished to return to Germany to train as a nurse at the Kaiserwerth Institute, and the Nightingales wearily consented after years of objecting to her plans in this regard. Florence thus spent 4 months completing her nursing training at Kaiserwerth in 1851. Within a year of her return, it became clear that Florence was as reluctant as ever to marry. She was also now in her 30s, and William Nightingale had begun to resign himself to her decisions. In an act of compassion, he settled an annual income of £500 on his youngest daughter in lieu of a marriage dowry. With this, Florence finally had the financial freedom to pursue her interests, and, beginning in 1853, she took up the post of chief matron and superintendent of the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Harley Street in London. She would soon be drawn to the very opposite side of Europe, though, where her reputation and historical legacy would begin to be carved out. It is peculiar the way that far-away events can thrust a person into the spotlight of history. In the case of Florence Nightingale, the very reason people know of her today, over a century after her death, is because of a series of events which began far away on the other side of Europe in 1853. Indeed, the initial spark point even came from the Levant. For well over a century, the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire had been frequently at war with each other over control of lands lying all around the Black Sea in the Crimea and Ukraine, the Caucasus, or the northeastern parts of the Balkans. Russia had even played a prominent part in the Greek War of Independence from Turkish rule in the 1820s, supporting the Greek revolutionaries. Generally speaking, the Russians had gained the upper hand in these conflicts in the 18th century and by the 19th century were on the ascendant as the Turks became the so-called sick man of Europe. A fresh war broke out between the two powers in 1853. It was sparked by a clash between several Christian powers and the Ottomans over access to the Holy Land in the Levant and, in particular, European access to places like Jerusalem, which at the time were part of the Ottoman Empire. This led the Russians to invade the northeast of the Balkans, and they quickly overran several provinces here in what is now Romania. The Ottomans stopped their advance into Bulgaria. Nevertheless, in London and Paris, there were concerns about the Russian advance in an age when Britain and Russia were major rivals in the Great Game for control over Central Asia. Fearing that Russia would expand to conquer much of the Ottoman Empire and become the dominant power of Europe over time, the British and French entered the war on the side of the Turks and sent large expeditionary fleets to the Black Sea, while also imposing a blockade on the Russian capital, St. Petersburg, in the Baltic Sea. This escalation of the war early in 1854 soon centered on British and French efforts, along with their Turkish allies, to capture the very important port of Sevastopol from the Russians on the Crimean Peninsula. The war would focus in this region over the next 2 years and has consequently become known as the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale's reputation would be carved out during it. Reading about the initially horrifying casualties among British troops, largely as a result of diseases such as cholera and malaria, as well as gangrene caused by unsanitary conditions in field hospitals where operations were being carried out, Florence wrote to her good friend Sidney Herbert at the War Department, offering her services as a nurse at the front. Serendipitously, Herbert was already in the process of writing to Florence himself to ask if she would head up a contingent of 38 nurses who were being sent to the combat zone of Scutari in Turkey, behind the front lines in the Balkans and the Black Sea. Florence quickly accepted the offer. It is important to get a sense of exactly how limited medical knowledge was at the time. For many centuries in Europe, doctors and physicians had operated according to the humoral theory of medicine. This was a concept which had been passed down from the Greek physician, surgeon and philosopher Galen, the greatest medical writer of the Roman Empire. He had hypothesized that the body's health was dependent on humours of which bile was a visible manifestation. These humours needed to be balanced in order to maintain the health of the individual. Accordingly, one of the most prominent kinds of medical treatment in early modern Europe was that of drawing blood, where some blood was drawn out of the system of the sick person to try and relieve their symptoms. There was a similar lack of sophistication when it came to pharmacology. Alcohol was used as anesthesia, and opiates had become more widely available as the English East India Company had begun conquering large parts of India and developing its trade there, which soon led to an abundance of opium being sent back to Europe. However, there was almost no knowledge of or access to things like anti-inflammatories, antibiotics, or non-narcotic painkillers. Admittedly, by the time Florence headed off to Turkey in 1854, things had advanced considerably. Historians in recent decades have begun writing about a medical revolution which occurred between the 17th and 19th centuries. It had started with a growing awareness of biology and the development of things like microscopes which allowed for the identification of bacteria. The humoral theory of medicine had also bequeathed some ideas which were not entirely inaccurate to Europe. For instance, this had held that vapours were released into the air from foul-smelling substances and bodies, and that these vapours could have a harmful impact on a person's health by further impacting the balance of the humours. Although the terminology was very different to how we describe these things today, what Galen and others have been writing about here was the way in which things that are rotting or which are diseased release foul smells as bacteria abounds. Since this is an environment in which disease will spread, the vapours they were describing were indeed dangerous, although their understanding of how it was dangerous was crude. This notion had therefore created a situation in which medical practitioners were increasingly aware of the need for sanitary conditions in which to minimize the spread of disease and bacteria. Nightingale arrived to the war front in the midst of great changes in this regard, some of which she would drive through her own work. Moreover, the middle decades of the 19th century were revolutionary in terms of the introduction of new medicines and methods. Chloroform, for instance, had just been introduced to European society as an effective type of anesthesia during surgery. All of these developments would have an impact on the path Nightingale was now about to set out on. The state of the British Army was grim indeed when Florence arrived at the hospital in Balaclava in the Crimean Peninsula in November of 1854. Resources to treat prisoners were scarce. The hospital was inadequately staffed, and the conditions were unsanitary. Florence and her fellow nurses were horrified and did the best they could to help elevate the care and treatment of the sick and wounded troops, as well as to implement sanitary measures in the hospital's wider environment and practices. In reality, without the assistance of a government health commission, there was little that the medical staff could do to improve matters on their own. Florence's ability to help in this crisis lay not only in her nursing skills, but also in the fact that she had friends in high places, including the media and government. She wrote to a friend who worked as a journalist for the Times in London, urging him to report on the horrifying casualties and the work that the hospitals were trying, with limited resources, to accomplish. Florence also lobbied friends in government positions to assist with the establishment of a sanitation program for the military hospitals in Crimea. During her first 6 months there, roughly 4,000 troops died in hospital, and less than 10% of those died of battle wounds. The rest had died of diseases which would have been preventable with proper sanitary measures. Shockingly, she would eventually claim that out of 18,000 deaths which she analysed amongst the British and their allies, 16,000 were the result of improper medical care and poor sanitation. In the spring of 1855, Lord Palmerston assembled a sanitary commission to respond to these concerns. The commission erected a prefabricated hospital building at Balaclava, cleared the surrounding sewers, and mobilised better treatment resources. British Army deaths in the Crimea plummeted as a result. This was Nightingale's great contribution to the British war effort in the Crimean War, the realisation that germs in hospitals and barracks were taking more men out of action and leading to many more deaths than were occurring on the field of battle. Her great innovation was convincing the authorities that sanitation needed to be taken more seriously in the care of the sick if unnecessary deaths were to be prevented. As an historical figure, Florence Nightingale has traditionally been treated by scholars as a rather saintly and one-dimensional figure. Only during the last 2 to 3 decades have historians finally begun to explore and question the rather hagiographic character that has been ascribed to her. Nightingale was a person like any other, not a saint. Much of her fame was built upon the initial framing of her life and work as they were written about in the British newspapers during the Crimean War, which was the first British military conflict to be thoroughly documented by what we now call war or combat journalists. The growth of Nightingale's legend as the Lady with the Lamp was largely an outgrowth of how she was portrayed in the press as an angel of mercy. Much of this was owing to a series of articles which appeared in The Times newspaper in London during 1854 and 1855, though some of it was presented visually. The Illustrated London News, for instance, published a plate or illustration depicting her in this way in February 1855. In contrast to this, in Turkey and the Crimea, Nightingale was initially known among some of the troops she nursed as the Lady with the Hammer, so named for her determination to smash open locked medicine stores in order to get what she needed to treat her patients. This epithet, however, was far too indelicate to suit an upper-class and socially well-connected woman who became a darling of the British press during the conflict. Yet, she was no shrinking violet, going from bed to bed, tenderly ministering to the sick, despite what the papers and even some poets tried to subsequently claim. Nightingale took an aggressive approach when needed to. The image of the Lady with the Lamp presented in the London newspapers was somewhat misleading concerning her work during the Crimean War. Recent studies have highlighted Nightingale's often problematic class consciousness during her service in the Crimean War. Her experiences with working-class doctors and her seeming conviction that only middle and upper-class medical personnel should serve as doctors or nurse matrons produced strained relations with a sizable proportion of the doctors and nurses she worked with. It even made her a few enemies among them. She has been criticized in recent times as well for refusing the offer of Jamaican businesswoman and nurse Mary Seacole who travelled to the Crimea at her own expense to nurse the suffering troops she had read about in England's newspapers. Mary's service had already been refused by the Herberts back in London. Determined to do what she could nonetheless, Mary then travelled to Balaclava and offered her services as a nurse to Nightingale. Florence refused, her decision possibly being based around metropolitan elitism at the height of Britain's empire, which rejected the possibility that an English nurse matron needed the help of a colonial woman. Again, this seems to have been class-motivated. One of Florence's surviving letters implies that her objection was based on the fact that Mrs. Seacole was a tavern keeper and a purveyor of alcohol, which Nightingale firmly believed had no place in the life or practice of a professional nurse. At the same time, whatever Florence's actual motivations might have been, the writings of both women indicate that they thought highly of one another and saw real value in one another's war work. Mary Seacole established a tavern, quite literally on the edge of the battlefield, for British troops and officers. She used a large proportion of her profits and her many years of experience as a healer to nurse the sick and wounded troops, even those among enemy combatants, and became a much-loved figure among the British soldiers stationed there. Perhaps Nightingale's initial refusal of aid from her was simply pride at not wanting her own position as head of the nursing unit to be undermined. The war itself was a bloody affair, one of the most destructive in terms of the loss of human life that the 19th century saw, an era which in Europe was comparatively peaceful once the Napoleonic Wars came to an end in 1815. There had been marked advances in weaponry in the nearly 40 years since the end of those wars and the outbreak of the Crimean War, and this was the first time that large European armies from several countries were deploying these weapons against one another. Moreover, the sheer size of the expeditionary forces deployed by the French and British to the Black Sea were unusual. Over 250,000 French soldiers served and approximately 100,000 British servicemen, deployment of forces to faraway theatres that was previously unimaginable in European warfare. All of this meant that the flow of wounded to the field hospitals that Nightingale and others were working in was greater than in earlier conflicts. It was a harrowing experience for her and others. Over 2 years of bitter fighting, nearly 5,000 British servicemen would be killed, while thousands more were wounded. Many suffered amputations after they were shot and badly wounded in an arm or a leg. These spent some time afterwards convalescing in the field hospitals, where cleanliness was paramount in order to avoid the dreaded gangrene from setting into the open wounds. Still, the war was not fought for nothing in terms of the reasons for British and French intervention. The key port of Sevastopol was captured by the British, French and Turks in September 1855 after a year-long siege. Once this was accomplished, peace negotiations accelerated, and the Treaty of Paris was agreed to in the French capital in March 1856. It was a victory for the Allied nations. Sevastopol and other occupied lands of the Crimean Peninsula were returned to Russian control, but it was forced to relinquish any territory it had occupied from the Turks, while resolutions were enforced to to demilitarize the Black Sea and to curb the threat of any further Russian advance southwards into the Balkans at the expense of the Turks for years to come. The bloody work Nightingale and her colleagues had undertaken had, at least, formed part of a successful British effort to stop the Russian expansion around the Black Sea, where, prior to the Anglo-French intervention, the Ottoman Empire was looking like being overrun by the Russians to a considerable extent. Conditions at the front during the war were such that eventually Florence herself had become sick, contracting what was euphemistically called the Crimean fever, halfway through her service in the spring of 1855. She returned home to London 6 months later, still terribly ill. Although she did partially recover, her overall health was never again strong enough for her to embark on nursing activities in a faraway war zone like the Black Sea. Indeed, some historians now believe that Florence's Crimean fever was in fact brucellosis, a blood-borne disease usually spread by ticks or infected animals which can produce debilitating and ongoing symptoms following initial recovery. Florence would suffer from it intermittently for the rest of her life. For several years after her return from the Crimean front, she also suffered from symptoms of what was most likely post-traumatic stress disorder after her battlefield nursing experiences. Despite being forced to live a more reclusive life in the years that followed on account of her illnesses, she doggedly continued her work as a healthcare reformer, largely through her writing and lobbying through correspondence. Though she suffered daily from headaches, exhaustion, digestive distress, and pain and weakness in her limbs, she continued to undertake research, to write books and pamphlets on nursing, sanitation, and public health, to advise medical authorities around the world, to mentor younger nurses, and to advocate for more education and employment opportunities for women like herself. Nightingale's achievements during the years following her service in Crimea were amazingly impressive considering her physical and health limitations. In 1856, she prepared and presented a report on the British military hospitals in Crimea, which highlighted the improvements she had seen in the housing and care of patients and the sheer number of lives that had been saved among the troops as a result. Nightingale's report made excellent use of mathematical diagrams as visual tools to communicate data results, including line and bar graphs, as well as her more famous polar area diagrams and rose diagrams. These were visual graphs that demonstrated the numbers of deaths caused by certain ailments and occurrences. Their name was acquired from the fact that the resulting graphs often resembled the ice spread of the polar regions or the shape of a rose bulb. Though Florence did not originate these mathematical data tools, she was one of the principal pioneers of their practical use in a time when representing statistical data on diagrams and charts was very innovative. Her impressive work with war data eventually led to Florence becoming the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society. She was also later made an honorary member of the American Statistical Association. During the late 1850s, she wrote numerous pamphlets and letters lobbying for the implementation of a new format of hospital care for Britain's workhouses that resembled the new model recently adopted by the British Army. These workhouses were quasi-prisons that proliferated in Britain in the 19th century as places where the poor and destitute were sent in an age before any structured system of welfare for the unemployed and ill. They were often rife with disease. Under Nightingale's plans, rather than being cared for by untrained or underpaid volunteers, the sick residents of workhouses would now be cared for by a staff of trained nurses. In 1860, a fund, which Florence's friend Sidney Herbert had started for her to honour her service in Crimea, paid for the establishment of the Nightingale School of Nursing, an institution which still exists and trains nurses today, as part of University College London. Florence's expertise and commitment to healthcare reform became still more widely known during the 1860s when she served as a nursing and sanitation advisor to officials in the United States during the American Civil War. The war had erupted in 1861 over the issue of slavery following the election of the abolitionist Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States. Within a short period of time, American troops were experiencing similar outcomes among their wounded and sick as the British had faced in Crimea, and Nightingale became a principal advisor to Dorothea Dix, a nurse matron and coordinator of care in the Union Army hospitals. Through her, some of the expertise which had been acquired through the trauma of the Crimean War was imparted to Union nurses operating in North America 10 years later. She also played a tangential role in the formation and early development of the United States Sanitary Commission, a body set up in 1861 to combat disease outbreaks in Union field hospitals. Nor was this the last time that Nightingale would play a role in the development of nursing in other countries. In the mid-1870s, Linda Roberts, a pioneering American nurse, spent time in England and trained in Nightingale's schools. Florence mentored her for a time. Roberts would subsequently return to the United States and oversaw the development of nursing schools in North America that mirrored the system Nightingale had established in Britain. In 1885, Roberts even went to Japan to advise on the development of nursing there as the country modernized, thus ensuring that Nightingale's methodologies and influence indirectly extended to the United States and the Far East. In recent years, the actual scale of Nightingale's achievements has been called into question. Some commentators have insisted that Nightingale took undue credit for dramatically lowering the death rates among sick and wounded soldiers in the Crimean War, but studies by two other Nightingale scholars point out that it was largely Nightingale's earliest biographers who ascribed these unrealistic feats of healing to her, not Florence herself. Luckily for Nightingale's biographers, she was an incredibly prolific writer, and there is an enormous wealth of writings from her still extant, most of which are publicly available. Florence wrote over 200 texts, including books, papers, treatises and pamphlets on nursing, sanitation, and healthcare in general. More than 14,000 of her letters have survived down to the present day. Moreover, one of her biographers described her as an inveterate hoarder of written material, something which makes the job of the historian much easier when it comes to reconstructing her views and actions. Nightingale kept copies of letters, drafts of letters, and hundreds of notes, all of which have been preserved in multiple collections. The Nightingale collection at the British Library, for example, is the second largest manuscript collection for any historical figure ever documented by the institution, and surpassed only by the papers of the eminent Victorian politician and Prime Minister, William Gladstone. Clearly, even though Florence was known to have destroyed some of her own correspondence and writings before her death, no doubt to protect her own privacy, she also had faith in history and left behind an obscenely large collection of letters and other primary sources to help future historians reconstruct her life, her character, and her work. Unlike many historical figures that frustrate historians because of how few documentary sources they left behind, the real challenge for historians and biographers of Florence Nightingale has been sifting through the sheer volume of documents and primary sources available and trying to decide which details are most relevant. Nightingale has often been represented as a feminist figure, one who cut a pioneering trail in numerous fields and defied the expectations of her age. However, the story is more complex than this allows for. For instance, Nightingale was not a particularly passionate suffragist in favour of women being given the vote at a time when political campaigning in favour of this was escalating in Britain. Rather, we should view her as someone who was fiercely individual in her outlook and in her desire to emancipate herself by breaking away from her family's expectations of her. In many other respects, though, she was hardly a proponent of women's rights. Her own opinion of women in general was low. Women, she wrote, craved sympathy more than anything, and she was critical of her fellow upper-class women for their idleness and adherence to social conventions. She viewed as particularly dim the idea that women from wealthier backgrounds should be given a good education in their youths and then do very little with it. Curiously, she also often even referred to herself as a, quote, man of business or a man of action, a clear sign of how she viewed her own active nature as being fundamentally akin to how men were expected to behave in Victorian Britain. Her criticisms of other women could become heated. A contemporary of Nightingale's was Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman in the United States to become a trained and certified medical doctor. Dr. Blackwell approached Florence during the late 1850s with the idea of setting up a medical school to train female doctors. Owing to the publicity which her work in the Crimea had generated, Nightingale had, by this time, amassed an impressive fund of donations totaling roughly £50,000 for the purposes of setting up a training school for nurses. She ultimately refused to donate any of these funds to Dr. Blackwell's project. Overall, the depiction of Nightingale as a Victorian feminist is more complicated than some portrayals of her allow for. While Nightingale wrote and published an extraordinary amount of material, as well as producing a huge volume of letters and other material that was not published, one of her works above the others stands out for its importance to the field of nursing. Its significance is belied by its slim size. When it was published for the first time in 1859, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, ran to just 76 pages, though it would be expanded over time as new editions appeared every few years. In it, The hero of the Crimean War stressed that the book was not intended as a comprehensive textbook on nursing. Rather, she composed Notes on Nursing as a kind of brief introduction to a developing field that would answer some of the basic questions a novice might have. It was also not intended exclusively as a book for professional nurses working in hospitals and other medical settings. Instead, some of the advice she proffered in the pages of the book could be applied to domestic settings and how mothers cared for their children or older children cared for an elderly parent. Some of the topics covered included how to ventilate rooms when someone was sick, and what diet should be followed both to maintain good health and nurse someone back from infirmity. Unsurprisingly, given the way she had earned her reputation in the Crimea and Turkey half a decade earlier, Nightingale was concerned with the issue of cleanliness and sanitation. She noted that maintaining a clean environment and changing bed sheets frequently were essential to avoid the spread of disease and ill health. Elsewhere, she simply poured out no-nonsense advice. For instance, Nightingale was adamant that nurses and those who cared for the sick shouldn't sugarcoat what they told their patients. If someone was sick, they needed to be told and then instructed firmly what to do to recover. Emphasis was laid on not over-exerting patients by forcing them to try and become active too quickly after an illness. Sections of the book were simply quaint. One passage discussed the relative merits of reading by the bedside of a patient. Much of this reads like common sense and well-understood wisdom today, but for an audience reading Notes on Nursing in the middle of the 19th century, it was a useful introduction. The book continued to be reprinted for many years and is still in print today, with new editions often appearing. Florence Nightingale gave her life to her work, her calling, as she described it, and beyond her work, her personal life was often without major events, despite the fact that she lived to be 90 years of age. She never married, maintaining her dogged refusal to do so after she returned home following the Crimean War. Florence had a small circle of friends with whom she remained close throughout her life, but her relations with her family remained distant and strained for many years as a result of the tensions in her 20s and 30s. William Nightingale died in 1874, which seemed to have the effect of bringing her closer to her mother and sister once again. Fanny was quite senile by this time, awakening Florence's compassion despite how critical her mother had always been of her. By the 1880s, Florence had recovered much of the old closeness with her sister, Parthenope, as well. The passage of time and the honours and accolades that Florence's career had brought no doubt helped to dissipate some of the ill feeling that had persisted for years between Florence and her family. She had been recognised and honoured several times by Queen Victoria and became the first recipient of the Royal Red Cross in 1883. On the 12th of May of 1890, on Florence's 70th birthday, her sister, Parthenope, died, bringing to an end her last ties to her family. Her grief was combated, no doubt, with work. Notes on Nursing had become a cornerstone of British nursing when nurse training was formalised across the country in 1873. Thereafter, dozens and then hundreds of nurse training schools had opened, many of them directly considered to be Nightingale schools. Though she often spent her time writing and popularizing her ideas rather than being active out in public, Florence was always a busy woman when her perennially precarious health allowed. Parthenope's passing no doubt brought home to Florence the fragility of her own life, and her health began to fail more significantly than before. For years, she had only received visitors on a limited basis at her South Street home in Mayfair in London, and usually only one at a time. By the mid-1890s, Florence was receiving fewer visitors than ever. Moreover, due to her increasing blindness, she had to employ a secretary in order to keep up with her writing and correspondence. By the turn of the 20th century, she found herself virtually unable to continue working, but she still continued to write annual addresses to the graduates from the Nightingale School. She was awarded several impressive accolades during the last decade of her life. For instance, in 1904, she was made a Lady of Grace of the Order of St. John and was awarded the Honorary Freedom of the City of London in 1908. The previous year, Nightingale had also become the first female recipient of the Order of Merit. These were some of the last developments of her life. Florence Nightingale died quietly in her sleep on the 13th of August 1910. She was 90 years of age. Her death was universally mourned, and the British government extended the honour of a burial in Westminster Abbey to the extended Nightingale family, though they declined, believing it was not what Florence would have wanted. The Times newspaper, which had carried many stories of her over half a century earlier during the Crimean War, described her in its lengthy obituary as, quote, the organizer of the Crimean War nursing service and one of the heroines of British history. Florence was laid to rest quietly and discreetly at St. Margaret's Church near her family's estate at Embley Park. Her tombstone was plain and bears only her initials and the dates of her birth and death. Florence Nightingale was one of the most significant figures in the revolutionary changes which were occurring in the field of medicine in the 19th century. This was a period of immense advances. When she was born in 1820, if a person was injured in a war setting, they would often face amputation of a limb, and the range of anesthesia available during surgery was very limited, the go-tos being alcohol or opium. Such drastic surgery often had to be performed because disease was so rife that gangrene could kill a person if a bullet was simply removed and the leg or arm retained. Aftercare was also very limited, and things which we take for granted, like standard painkillers, anti-inflammatories, and antibiotics, were all unavailable in 1820. By the time Florence died in 1910, the field of medicine and patient care had been transformed. There were many, many more effective medicines and an understanding of disease and infection. The average military field hospital during the First World War of the 1910s was very different to the Napoleonic Wars of the 1810s. Florence Nightingale played a considerable role in this transformation. During the Crimean War of the 1850s, she developed new methods of treating wounded soldiers by placing an emphasis on cleanliness and sanitation so as to prevent deaths after surgery and from a range of related disease outbreaks in field hospitals. Later, she undertook important work in developing schools to professionalise the field of nursing in Britain. Her work was not simple or based on rudimentary ideas of cleanliness. Over a period of decades, she produced statistical data which backed up her arguments that working in a certain way and training professional nurses could have a very beneficial impact of survival rates and health outcomes. She also wrote extensively to promote her ideas. In doing so, she played a vital role in the modernization of the fields of medicine and patient care during a revolutionary period in the second half of the 19th century. What do you think of Florence Nightingale? Did the image of the lady with the lamp do her justice? Or, as many recent historians have argued, did the earliest journalists and biographers to document her do her and her admirers a disservice by turning a complex woman of many parts into the one-dimensional figure of a saint? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.